Welcome to The Dreamboat. This is where we explore everything to do with dreams.
We are sponsored by the DRI Centre for Dream Studies, and you can find out more about our work in the show notes.
You can join us here every fortnight or at one of our dream courses, workshops, or retreats. Thank you for coming on board.
Near-death experiences are well documented, and accounts by people who have said to have died and come back have many similar components: passing down a tunnel, merging into a bright light, and an overwhelming sense of love. But what is life like after a return to Earth, or this plane of existence, or whatever we're going to call it? And what is their dream life like? Does such a traumatic experience of coming close to death change how you sleep and dream? Today, I'm joined by Nicole Lindsay, a researcher at the School of Psychology at Massey University in New Zealand, who has led a fascinating study into the relationship between near-death experiences, often called NDEs, and dreaming. Nicole, lovely to have you here. Like everybody who's probably asked you this before, what actually inspired you to do your research in NDEs?
So, hi, Laura, by the way. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
It's kind of been, a lifelong journey in a way. I've always been really fascinated in unusual states of consciousness, having experienced a few of them myself over the years. And so I did my psychology degree back in the day, and I wanted to do my master's in something to do with consciousness. So even back then, I had a really sort of burning desire to know more about it. But this is in the 90s. And so that really didn't feature on the psychology curriculum, consciousness in any way. Yeah, and I basically sort of tried to find a supervisor, and nobody was very keen, and I got fobbed off a wee bit and told that this was really fell under the domain of philosophy rather than psychology.
Oh, really?
Which I thought was quite puzzling, because I thought, surely it must, it's obviously got something to do with psychology. But so I kind of put that idea aside for a few years and went off traveling to your part of the world, actually. And then I eventually made my way back to New Zealand, and I thought by then about 20 years had passed and the psychology had moved on a little bit. And so there was a much greater openness to exploring unusual phenomena. And I was surprised to find that there was even a whole area of psychology devoted to studying near-death experiences.
Really? I didn't know that at all. Gosh, that is quite something, isn't it?
It is. It's actually been studied since 1975 is when it took off. You wouldn't really know that. So it's been studied for about 50 years, near-death experiences.
Wow.
Yeah. The early researchers, though, I think struggled to get recognition and to be able to publish in more mainstream journals. So they had to start their own journal to be able to publish their work. And then as time went on, I think in particularly the last 20 years, acceptance for these kind of experiences is really growing, and mainstream journals are now sort of publishing and interested in having this kind of work in their journals, which has really been great for the discipline. Yeah, so that's kind of how I got into it. And I ended up doing a PhD on near-death experiences. And in that PhD, I was looking at the after effects, particularly how that transformed people's understandings of death and their attitudes towards death. It was super fascinating, actually. So that was a mixed method study where I did a lot of interviewing of people, and I did gathered some survey data. And then from there, I just carried on, academically, researching in the space. So it's such a fascinating area. I think you can really never get bored with it. So that kind of led me to, I guess, one thing after another to why I did this particular study. just over the years observing and listening to a lot of experiences and how it had transformed their life and the type of changes that they made and observed in themselves. And so sleep and dreaming had been something, and unusual experiences, anomalous experiences like psychic abilities, which might sound a bit out there for some people, but it's the truth. People who have NDEs
Exactly.
talk about that after effect extensively.
Yeah, interesting. I should declare now, and Nicole knows this, that I did have an NDE when I was in my teens. So back in the 1970s, I'm that old. And so I'm intrigued as to how other people reported it, because it's not something I've ever really looked at. It was something that happened. And I know a lot of people have gone on and talked quite a lot about it. I mentioned it for anybody who's read my book, which is about mindfulness and not NDEs. But I would say I would sign up that I did have more psychic abilities post the NDE. But I'm intrigued because whenever I've read about it, other people we've all had very similar experiences. And people talk about the moment that it happened and what actually occurred, which, as I said in the intro, the bright light going down the tunnel, all of that type of thing. But I'm intrigued because not many people have ever asked me, how has it affected my life? And hearing you talk made me think, it's a question that I know how to answer, but most people, if you say you've had an NDE, they look at you a bit weirdly and then want to move on. It's like they're really quite sort of, I don't know if they don't believe you or whatever it is. It's quite interesting. Most people are quite scared of it. But for me, and I'm intrigued now because it has, I would say, changed my dream life, or did change my dream life. But also it just changed my whole attitude to life. I literally came back and threw myself at life and made loads of mistakes, as you do. But as a result, I've got a very, I think, embracing attitude to life. And I have quite fixed ideas now on what happens when you die, I suppose. And is that what a lot of people tend to say, Nicole?
Yes, you sound very typical, actually. I'd love to talk to you more about that. Oh, I could have got you to take part in my study, actually.
Yes, exactly.
It's funny, isn't it? I find that there's almost two camps of people when you bring the subject up. There's people who are super fascinated and they're like, oh, wow, tell me more about that. I want to know. And then there's the other people that don't really know what to do with it, their information, and will tend to just look at you a little bit puzzled and then change the conversation quite quickly. So fortunately, I meet a lot more of the first camp these days. So I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in New Zealand, it's almost a taboo topic, actually. There's a lot of stigma around it. That's changing, thankfully. That has changed a lot. I think with podcasts like yours and other ones, exploring NDEs, people are a lot more aware that this is actually a genuine phenomena now. But, in the early days, they used to think people were either psychotic or making up these stories. And then as research went on and our resuscitation techniques improved, more and more people were, coming back to life and talking about these kind of experiences. So really the phenomena just couldn't be ignored anymore. And as I said, there's a huge body of research out there now exploring near-death experiences in more depth. And so my particular area of interest, being a psychologist, is the after effects of these experiences and how do they transform people's lives. So what you mentioned there seems pretty typical. There's a whole array of after effects. I could tell you some of the most common and see if you have these.
Oh, yes, I'm really, really interested because I've never had a chance to ever ask somebody. And it is an interesting piece of psychology, yeah. I don't talk about it
well,
much
you can
normally.
ring me anytime, Laura. I'm always happy to chat about it.
So tell us some of the common ones.
Okay, so what I'll be saying is based on what I've heard from New Zealanders, but also the wider literature. There's not a huge difference between Kiwis and the general body of literature, a few minor details, and it might slightly differ between people in the UK as well, but in general, pretty similar across cultures. So the probably the most common thing is a reduced fear of death, and some people, it completely removes their fear of death to the point where they're like looking forward to dying, which can be, especially for children, you can imagine having a child who might have had an NDE saying, I just want to die again. It's quite disturbing for parents to hear that. But they mean it usually because that reality that they've experienced, the NDE state of consciousness, is so compelling that it's preferable to being in this reality. So the reduced fear of death is probably the most common after effect, and a revised understanding of what death is. So in the research I did, most people would say that they realise that death is not death in the way that you might perceive it. It's more a shift in consciousness, but your awareness remains. So having that, which you touched on, I think, having that understanding of death completely changes the way you live your life. And so another common after effect is this new renewed zest for life and just living life to the fullest. So you have an appreciation for death, but you also have a renewed appreciation for life. And so a lot of people will find that the old fears they might have had that held them back have been removed. So they will just jump into, headlong into all sorts of interesting ideas and activities that they might not have pursued beforehand. And I've had some fascinating case studies around there of people who grew up in a terrible environment full of drugs and spent many years in prison, etc., and had an NDE and transformed literally overnight to the point where, I'm thinking of this one particular case, where they never touched drugs, they didn't drink, they didn't smoke, they didn't do anything ever again. They enrolled in university, did a counselling degree, and then went on to work rehabilitating other offenders.
Wow.
And that transformation was just so remarkable. There's not many, I don't even think there's very few areas in psychology that can bring about that kind of change, very few therapeutic techniques. So that, I think, demonstrates the power of the experience, that it can be that transformative. So then there's so people tend to have a heightened sense of spirituality, and that's not religious necessarily. Typically, it would be that you become more spiritual but less religious. That's common. A sense of purpose in life is common, and often people might not know what that is. They just know that they feel like they've been given a second chance. So they're sort of out there trying to do something good for humanity, and so they might change their careers, and quite often people will enter the helping professions, so in healthcare, mental health, or just generally helping nature or animals or anything that is more than just themselves. So that's very common, career changes. And then we have sort of really some more interesting and slightly more controversial ones, like the psychic abilities. And people tend not to know what to do with that one much in the research space as well, because psychic phenomena is also stigmatized, but it's a very, very real and very common after effect of having an NDE.
So interesting. So interesting. I mean, people don't want to talk about psychic stuff, and there's a set acceptable language around it. And I find it fascinating that it's very difficult to research or to put forward as a piece of research. And yet both Jung and Freud themselves were both fascinated by what I think Jung called it the spooky other. And Freud said if he hadn't studied, if he hadn't, become a sort of psychologist as such or a psychoanalyst, he would have become a psychic research scientist. He was so fascinated by that particular area because the more he worked with people in let's call it the counselling space, the more he realised interesting things happened. And I'm finding it very interesting that, and for people listening, I work with a recording platform that enables me to use my camera. This time I am disembodied. The camera is refusing to come on. And now I find that as part of this subject really fascinating, because I cannot see myself on screen. Nicole cannot see me. I'm like a disembodied voice probably for her, which is what radio is about, obviously, and podcasts are about. But a lot of people watch their podcasts on YouTube where you get the pictures as well. And we often put up, video clips from our recordings. Well, we won't be able to do that with this. We'll have some nice shots of Nicole, though. But I am just a black, disembodied voice, which, in view of the subject, I find really quite fascinating.
Oh, well, I didn't mention the other very common after effect, and this is obviously very relevant for today, is electromagnetic disturbances and phenomena. So people who have had NDEs have a sensitivity to electromagnetic phenomena, and they also are able to affect it. And again, that's quite common, like about 75%
I love
of
it.
people. Yeah.
Oh, my family will so love that, because, my partner always jokes, oh God, you're about to do something with IT or technical stuff, and it always goes wrong. Something will always happen. I will always have an impact on it in some strange way. And for a long time, I couldn't wear a watch. I could wear a watch for a while, and then it would just go completely haywire and break. It was it's a bit of a family joke.
Yes.
Didn't realise that.
Because I had an NDE when I was very young, like 2, so I can't. Ooh. Yeah, so if you get 2 NDE, like this happens all the time, Laura. If I'm like interviewing a person who had an NDE, or I'm in this situation, there's technical errors all the time. It's like,
you didn't tell me that at the start. So you had one when you were 2, did you? Wow.
Yes. Well, I don't always talk about it because it's because I was so young. I can't articulate it that well because I couldn't at the time. But I died for about, according to my mum, maybe 10 minutes or something like that. And
oh goodness!
Ever since then, I've always had a fascination with trying to get it back out of my body, basically.
Yes.
And even as a young person, I used to be fascinated with other dimensions and out-of-body experiences. And I just the thing I took away from my very young experience was just the sense of well-being and feeling like there's a greater purpose, and that everything made sense. It's just difficult for me to articulate now. I just have inner knowing about the sort of knowledges and things I took away from that. Later in life, I had what's known as a mystical experience, which is very similar, except it's not initiated by a life-threatening situation. That was during meditation. I had that. And that was very similar and also very profound. Oh, so if you've had one NDE, you're much more prone to other altered states of consciousness as well. Spontaneous.
So true. Yep. Very, very true. If I meditate, I can check out, go have a look around a room, a town or whatever, and come back. And I when meditating, and I meditate a lot, and I went through a period of quite a lot of meditation, and it was interesting the experiences that you can get from that. As you say, I think people who listen to this podcast regularly know that dreaming for me is just a turn of the dial. And a lot of people, particularly when they lucid dream, and let's come on to that in a minute, but they're all what I call slight changes of frequency, like a radio dial of consciousness. And whether it's an NDE or an out-of-body experience, an OBE, I think as people call them, mystical experiences, they're all just slight tweaks of the radio dial. They're just all slightly changed frequencies. And for some people, dreaming is where you can access those type of experiences in the way that people who regularly meditate can access some of those experiences just through meditation. So I find there's a massive crossover in all of these consciousness subjects, for want of a better description.
Yeah. there definitely is. Yeah. And I like that description of changing the frequency. I often feel like if you've had an NDE, somebody's turned the dial up really high and it stays there. So afterwards, another after effect is hypersensitivity and enhanced sensory abilities. So you might have noticed, Laura, as well, that your sensitivity to sound and light would have increased, and other senses, smell. Often people have a dominant sense, but I'd say the light sensitivity and the sort of intolerance for high, sharp, loud noises as well. And then obviously you've got the sixth sense. So it's literally like somebody's meddled with your neurological system and I think turned it right up high so that you can just tune into a lot more than you used to. Yeah.
That's so, all of that, very, very true, actually. Very true. I would say there were certain components there before the NDE, but it became directly sharpened afterwards, quite amazingly so. And for a while, I think I was quite scared of it, and I sort of shut a lot of it down. But after a while, I didn't. I felt I became interested in it and more accepting. I think I wasn't so fearful because I was, 19 when it happened. And, I sort of, for a while, I was trying to get on with my life. I was already at college and I was studying. And so, I tried to get my life back on track very quickly, which I did do. But as you say, psychologically, there were a lot of changes. And dreaming-wise, yes, I would lucid dream quite, without really sort of thinking anything significant about it. It's only when I joined the dreaming community that I realised that lucid dreaming is not something that everybody does, for want of a better description.
Yeah,
yeah. And, obviously the podcast is about dreaming. When you did the research, what type of dreaming effects did people talk about who had NDEs? What did you notice?
We've done a couple of studies, actually, and there's one that you'll probably like as well that's going to be published in about 2 weeks, I think, in the journal Psychology of Consciousness. And that was a follow-up study to the quantitative one, which I'll talk about in a second. But this one's qualitative, so it goes into depth and about the dream experiences of people that have had NDEs, and there's a lot of descriptions in there that you might resonate with, Laura. So check it out. But anyway, so we did 3 studies in this area looking at sleep and dreaming in association with NDEs. And the one that got a bit of traction was a survey that we did, and we looked at, I think we had about 315 participants. And I'm just guessing roughly about 138 of those had a near-death experience. I think 45 had a close brush with death, but not the conscious phenomena associated with NDEs. And then 129 or something were our control group. So they were just average sort of sleepers in the population. And they did an array of psychometrics that measured their post-traumatic stress symptomology, trauma symptoms, basically, and types of dreaming phenomena. So we measured lucid dreaming, precognitive dreaming, out-of-body experiences, sometimes known as astral traveling, sleep paralysis, nightmares, dream recall, dream vividness, etc. And then we also administered the near-death experience scale, which is commonly used in NDE research, and that measures the types of features and the amount of features that people experience during the NDE, things like experience of light, being able to heighten senses, out-of-body experiences, etc. So what we found was that the people who had NDEs were much more likely to have particularly lucid dreaming. The frequency of lucid dreaming was highly significantly more likely to occur in people who had NDEs compared to the other 2 groups. Precognitive dreaming and the out-of-body experiences. So they were the three main ways that they differed from the other two groups. And we did some analyses to figure out whether that was related to the trauma of coming close to death or whether it was the phenomenology of the NDE. And it turned out it was strongly related to the NDE and not the trauma. Sleep paralysis and nightmares were related to the traumatic aspects of the experience, but those more anomalous experiences were related to the NDEs. So that was really interesting to see. And then the follow-up study, we interviewed 13 people who felt their dreaming had changed to find out more about that. So we gathered some in-depth data around their experiences. Yeah, and so some of those are probably too complex to even try and summarize here, but really, really interesting. So things like past life, so time, their perception of self and time and space, I guess, changes after the NDE. So in dream states, people would have a lot more what they perceive to be past life dreams. So they would feel like they were living another life themselves, but in another lifetime. And these kind of dreams are very vivid, and they often involve an element of trauma like death or war or something like that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we had people reported a much higher frequency of precognitive dreams. So they would dream about things that were going to happen in the future. And those can be little things, like just dreaming about seeing a golden retriever in their dream down at the shops, and then that would happen. One of my participants talked about how she'd always dream about this golden retriever that she didn't know. And then she would see him all the time. He was a local golden retriever, and he'd pop up at the shops, or he'd be in the corner. She dreamed he'd be there. And she was like, what is it with the golden retriever? And then others had more dreams about significant events like 9/11 and the Queen dying. So
yeah, quite a few people who I know of, particularly in the psychic community, quite a few people foresaw 9/11 and dreamt it or had a visualization of it. The same for me with the tsunami as well, the big tsunami. That was again, a lot of people in that sort of world, for want of a better description, who I have spoken to all had very similar experiences around that as well. And also I would sign up for the past life side of things as well, when I've been taken on what's known as, like a past life journey by someone facilitating that. I had some very, very powerful experiences. I suppose the big question, Nicole, is what is actually happening? What do you think is happening for people who have had an NDE? What makes them susceptible to better lucid dreaming or, astral traveling? What do you think is happening?
I'll give you my perspective. So looking at it from multiple angles and looking at other types of extended states of consciousness, there are some people, a proportion of people that have NDEs that say they had these kind of abilities beforehand, but that's quite small. And they'll say that it enhanced their abilities. And then the majority have not had any kind of abilities like this before. And then they have an NDE and all of a sudden they've got this antenna where they seem to be able to tune into way more than they ever had before. And it can be a bit destabilizing for a lot of people who aren't used to that. And they will and I see this a lot in New Zealand, I think, because we don't really have any established frameworks as such, not being a highly secular country, for trying to understand and integrate these experiences. So they'll kind of shut it down. But what's interesting is if you try to repress the phenomena and the after effects, it kind of comes out in other ways, and people might end up with a lot of neurological problems like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome and things like that. So integration of your NDE seems to be really important for being able to manage the after effects, physical and psychological.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that would so make sense, actually. Makes sense.
So if you had an NDE out there and you haven't talked to anyone, I'd definitely advise you to find a support group to chat to. There's a good organisation called the International Association of Near-Death Studies, and they set up chapters all around the world for people who have had NDEs to come together, and they have meetings and probably meetups on Zoom, etc., for people to sort of share their stories and their experiences. And it's really, I think, really helpful for people who've had these kind of experiences. So that will help you integrate those experiences and transform sometimes PTSD symptomology and effects. It can relieve those, which is really interesting too. Yeah, so without having a framework, you can have a lot of PTSD effects, but then understanding it, be able to figure out, oh, lots of people have had this and these things have helped them, can relieve a lot of those symptoms. I think I've gone off track, sorry, from what you asked me.
Yeah, no, well, Nicole, that's really fascinating. I was interested in what you thought the reason was that people who've survived an NDE, why they have these ability to lucid dream quite easily, and other sort of out-of-body experiences, whether dreaming or not dreaming.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's probably 3 possible reasons, I think. One is, which I started talking about, you might be in some way sensitive to this kind of phenomena beforehand. Maybe you've got some sort of neurological configuration that makes you sensitive to unusual phenomena. But I don't know if that's the most likely explanation, just because there's so many people that seem to have these experiences that didn't have anything like these abilities beforehand. They didn't lucid dream, they didn't have out-of-body experiences, etc. But that is one possible explanation. The second one is psychological. So you have an NDE, and then usually they can be paradigm shifting a lot in the way that you situate yourself and perceive the world around you. So often you become a lot more open to unusual phenomena because you've had something happen to you. So psychologically, you then start to be way more open, and you might take up meditation. That's quite common for people who have had NDEs.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And other types of yoga and things like that, other types of activities that kind of encourage the expansion of conscious states. And so psychologically, you just might become more open to it, basically, and you start looking for meaning in your dreams. You can cultivate lucid dreams. As you know, a lot of people do that, practice lucid dreaming, and you get better and better at it the more you practice it. So having an NDE might lead you to go into that space and foster those kind of experiences. And then the third reason, which I'm most interested in, and probably are heading towards that, is there's a neurological shift that happens in your brain after an NDE. And it's sort of like what we were talking about before. I guess the best way I can describe it is you shifted your frequency. So neurologically, you turn the dial up, and that seems to be a permanent shift. So after the event of the NDE, that's not the end of the story. Your mind or your consciousness has been transformed and expanded in some way, and that means that you're much more open and able to intercept and receive more information out there in I'm not even sure how to describe it, in the quantum field, let's say, or the field of consciousness.
The Dreamboat is a project of the DRI Centre for Dream Studies. If you're the kind of person who is fascinated by the mystery of dreams and you want to learn more about the transformational power of dream work, check out our workshops, lectures, retreats, and training courses at driccpe.org.uk. Also on the website, you can support the podcast and all of DRI's work by becoming a member for just over £30 a year. That gets you discounts and first access for our ticketed events, as well as access to videos and extra material online. That's driccpe.org.uk, and you can find the link in the show notes. Now back to the podcast.
Hearing your 3 descriptions, I think, Nicole, are really lovely. And I can tick boxes, in all 3 of the boxes, actually, when I think back. But I like how you've explained it as a neurological shift, and I think there's something in that, even if for you when you were 2, you might not have recognised it, but you've grown into it as you've got older. And I think when I was 19, all I knew was I really wanted to get on with life and make the most of it, and felt freed in some way from something that most people spend their life in fear of, I suppose. And as I've got older, I've sort of, I don't know, I end up doing lots of different things, but I've always been phenomenally interested in what you would call neurological shift work, this work that involves consciousness in some way, this shifting of the dial, as I call it. And I'm very intrigued that for people who've had NDEs, and I'm wondering also for people who might not have had a full NDE but have had an OBE, a shocking out-of-body experience, whether that turning of the dial, just as you say, does something to the dream life, to your dream life in some way.
Yes, it does. So this is the other reason why I'm heading towards the neurological explanation, because if you look at other groups of people, for example, long-term meditators and advanced meditators, people who've had in practice and cultivate out-of-body experiences, they also experience the turning of the dial, as we say. So, for example, long-term meditators, and particularly those who've experienced unitive consciousness, which is that sense of oneness with the universe, I guess, they have a lot more lucid dreams. So we see a correlation between meditation and lucid dreaming as well. So that's like a red flag for me. And lucid dreamers are much more likely to have out-of-body experiences. So there's definitely connections between all these expanded states. The interesting thing about NDEs, though, is they seem to have this radical shift in consciousness instantaneously, and after only one episode. Whereas, you haven't had to meditate for 20 years to have these experiences. It kind of suggests to me the intensity of the experience of your shift in consciousness is just as important as the amount of time you've spent in altered states of consciousness.
And I think your use of the word unitary consciousness, which is the heart of, say, those that follow a Buddhist tradition of some kind, or, through meditation or whatever form of Buddhism you're choosing to practice, it's a notion of a unitary state. I like, your 2-year-old self, that's where you go to. That's one of the hallmarks, I think, of the experience, is that you have this amazing sense of oneness, that you are merging with something greater than you, but is still part of you. It's truly phenomenal. And I like how you explain that. I think that's really beautifully put, actually.
Oh, well, actually, you might be interested to know, Laura, and you're an interesting case study, I think, in yourself, that the younger you have the NDE, the greater these shifts in a way. Because I think you've had it your whole life and you accept it as normal until you get to a certain age and go, hang on a minute, other people aren't having these things. But you've developed that muscle. You've been working on it for a while. So one thing I found in my research was the younger the age that the person had the NDE, the stronger and more advanced, I guess you could say, their abilities were to enter other expanded states of consciousness and had more paranormal activity happening to them, or more psi abilities. So there was a correlation there with age.
I find that actually really fascinating, because there does seem to be something that clusters around people who've had NDEs. And you're mentioning a lot of different states that I have heard of, both dreaming and non-dreaming states as such. And it's almost like a blending of different forms of consciousness. It's easy to move in and out of states, I think, which It's hard to explain to somebody if that's not open to you. I personally, Nicole, and I don't know how you feel about this, because as you quite rightly touched on, people can learn to lucid dream. And I know that people can learn to improve their psychic abilities and learn how to do an out-of-body experience through meditation or do visualizations. So this, whatever happens, is available, I think, to everybody. I just think, as you nicely put it, if you've had an NDE or an out-of-body experience, it just makes you more susceptible to it in an easier framework, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's the best way
It's
of
almost like a
describing
crash
it.
course, isn't it? As opposed to having to spend 20. But yeah, if you're interested in lucid dreaming and or precognitive dreaming, meditation would be, in the absence of having a near-death experience, meditation is sort of a pathway, I think, towards cultivating those kind of experiences. Yeah.
No, I agree.
There's some people have that, and I've heard this a bit from experiences, and maybe you relate. You just seem to have higher agency in your dream, your consciousness, waking consciousness in a way, trance or merges with dream state consciousness. So you have a lot more agency in your dream states, and your dreams are often way more vivid and coherent, not as bizarre and fragmented. You still have normal dreams, but you have a lot more of those really sort of super vivid, coherent, almost not like dreams, actually, more like NDEs, but in the dream state. So that was something I found actually in the last study we did, was people had integrated elements of their NDE into their dream world. For example, a common thing that might happen to somebody in an NDE is meeting a being of some sort. Often, well, in New Zealand, that's usually a deceased person, but that's common as well everywhere around the world. And so that person, I'm thinking of one really great account actually, where one of the participants had an NDE. He was an older man. He had his NDE, and there was a woman in his NDE that he hadn't seen since he was at university, so 50 years or so. And he didn't really know anything about her life or anything like that. And he saw her. And then afterwards, a couple of weeks after his NDE, she started entering his dream states every night. And to the point where she was wanting him to write a book about her life experiences. So he was doing it. He'd have a dream and she'd instruct him what to write and where to go and find out stuff about her life. And he'd get up. He said he'd wake up in the middle of the night, like 3, and he'd get up and he'd go and type it up while her thoughts and stuff was still there. And then the next night he'd go back into the same dream state, and she would say to him, well, that's right, what you wrote last night, or that's not quite right, you need to change it like this. Yeah, this went on for a good year. Yeah, well, like he co-wrote a book. He says, I co-wrote a book with her.
Oh, wow. And was she deceased, or was she on this side? Was she deceased, or?
Yeah, she was deceased. Sorry, I forgot to mention that.
She was deceased, yeah.
He didn't know that, though, at the time. When he had his NDE, she appeared, and then he kind of found out, he looked her up, and he found out she had died many, many years ago.
Well, interesting.
Yeah, and so she was coming into his dream states. So it seems to be a forum to be able to access stuff beyond this conscious reality.
Well, a lot of lucid dreamers, a lot of lucid dreamers do, particularly regular and proficient lucid dreamers, often say that they meet certain beings that tell them universal truths, for want of a better description, almost like angelic figures or characters that are like spiritual guides. And, guide them once they've come back after the NDE, are still there with them. So for them to appear in the dream state, I really like that. And that would make sense with what other people have reported who are regular lucid dreamers.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And again, it talks about what we were just touching on there about the states almost merging. Yeah, once you've had one, particularly the NDE, it's like you've been given access to higher realms of consciousness, which seems to be like it's almost like a King's Cross train station. All things can meet in there. It's just so interesting. And just the past life thing, the precognitive thing. Oh, and the other fascinating thing that people talked about that I hadn't anticipated was merging with other people's consciousness, living people's consciousness. So they would dream about, say, their friend, but they felt like they were in their body and they could taste what that person was eating for breakfast and things like that. So they would have these brief momentary merging of consciousness with somebody else. And that was distinguished from past life dreams because they knew it wasn't them. It was somehow they tapped into somebody else's consciousness for a brief moment in time. So they would have a lot more of these types of experiences in dream states as well, which I found really fascinating. And that can happen in NDEs as well. People will sometimes tell you, well, I was out of my body and I could see my body down below, but I could also hear my husband's thoughts at the same time. Yeah, so that seems to be something that people speak about in NDEs that also transferred into the dream state afterwards, that ability. Yeah.
Amazing. It really is. It's just such a rich subject, Nicole. I obviously first read about you in the IASD, the International Association for Study of Dreams journal. There's Nicole will know, there's a regular volume that comes out with research like Nicole's in it, and that's where I first read about your research. If people want to learn more about what you're doing with this, Nicole, how do they read about you or find out what you're doing?
So if you want to know more about NDEs, there's quite a lot of literature out there. But if you're interested in it from an academic perspective, you can go on Google Scholar and just type in near-death experiences and hundreds of articles will come up. If you want something a bit more palatable, I guess, or easier to read, there's a lot of stuff actually out there now, podcasts, websites. As I mentioned before, the International Association of Near-Death Studies has a really good website that's got heaps of information on it. That's a nice little hub to go to. In terms of the studies that I'm doing, I guess on the Massey website, we put up our publications and things like that we're working on. The studies are also published in the literature, all going well. That one that we were talking about was in the Dreaming Journal. Dreaming.
That's the one I've got.
Yes.
I would normally hold it up to the camera, but obviously as I'm on blackout and I'm just disembodied voice today, I can't do that. But yes, it's where I obviously first read about you. And but thank you for Nicole for all the guidance of where people can go, and I'll put a lot of that in the show notes so people will be able to find out more about you and more about the subject as well, because it's such a rich, fascinating subject. And I'm so glad that someone like you, Nicole, is beginning to scratch at the surface and, to use your word, make it palatable for people so that it doesn't sound so wacky and so scary. I mean, I presume when you put out your research, you said you had 138 survivors. I presume these were just people who heard about it in New Zealand, but globally there must be thousands of people who have experienced this phenomenon.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Like, it's way more common than most people think. So for people that have had a close brush with death and lost consciousness, and maybe even been under cardiac arrest and dead temporarily dead for a period of time, at the moment, the figures show that around, on average, 15% of those people will recall a near-death experience during that time of clinical death. So it's quite high. It's nearly everywhere I go, if I'm talking or somebody knows that I study this phenomena, somebody will come up to me and go, oh, I had one of those, or I know somebody that did. So once you open up a, comfortable, safe space, you wouldn't believe how many. And then other people might want to tell me about other paranormal stuff that's happened to them. I think it's becoming, I wouldn't put NDEs in the container of paranormal though anymore, because they're becoming, because they're so well studied, we're sort of learning more and more about them. Same with lucid dreaming, right? That used to be seen as something paranormal, but now it's not. And they even have lucid dreaming therapy. So it's just more about increased understanding around these experiences. So they're really fascinating and they're nothing to be fearful of. Sometimes people can have distressing NDEs though, but that doesn't mean that you're morally deficit in any way. Some people worry about that, but no, that's just a random thing that happens. But yeah, I would definitely encourage you to go and have a look and read up about what you can about NDEs, whether you're scientific or not. There's information available for everybody out there about NDEs. Yeah, I find it fascinating. I'm so happy I get to research in this area.
Nicole, thank you very, very much, and carry on the very interesting work. And I'm sure we'd love to have you back on soon.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to.
So, thank you for joining us for this week's episode. Don't forget to like us and leave comments on your favourite podcast platform. As I'm sure you know, that's the way we build an audience for the Dreamboat podcast and also to spread news about dreaming. And as we said, there are many ways you can share your dreams at the DRI, the Dream Research Institute.
Yes, we have courses, events, and workshops, and we want to hear from you. So check out the show notes for links, or find us on Instagram and on our Facebook page and on our website at driccpe.org.uk. And if you want to explore your dreams further, or you would like to support us, you can join the DRI as a member for just £30 a year. As a member, you will get discounts for all of our events and short courses. You'll get our newsletter with latest dream research news, and we'll also be adding other special member benefits during the year. Of course, members' dreams will always be given preference for reading on the podcast Dream of the Week slot. So go to the link on the show notes and become a DRI member today. Keep dreaming and keep sharing your dreams.